This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 3rd of May 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. On today's programme, we look through the week's news and culture with international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor Nina dos Santos. Plus, editor-at-large of The Nightly, Latika Bourke, joins us from Canberra as the final polls close on election day in Australia. Then, Joanna Reynolds, CEO of the Folio Society, introduces their summer collection and explains how the company has successfully attracted a new generation of readers. That's all ahead here on Monocle on Saturday with me, Georgina Godwin. First though, here's the news. Australia has been voting today in a national election that polls show will likely favour Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labour Party over the Conservative opposition, as worries about Donald Trump's volatile policies overshadowed calls for change. Both of Australia's major parties have focused on cost of living pressures, but opinion polls show that global uncertainty, driven by Trump's stop-start tariffs, rapidly became a top issue for voters during the campaign. Singapore too has been voting in a poll almost certain to perpetuate the unbroken rule of the People's Action Party in a test of public approval for the new Prime Minister as the city-state braces for economic turbulence from a global trade war. The cost of living and housing availability in one of the world's most expensive cities are key issues and a continued challenge for the incumbent, whose government has warned of recession if the trade-dependent economy becomes collateral damage in the war over steep US tariffs. Israel bombed an area near the presidential palace in Damascus on Friday, in its clearest warning yet to Syria's new Islamist-led authorities of its readiness to ramp up military action in the name of the country's Druze minority. Israel has escalated military operations in Syria since rebels ousted Bashar al-Assad in December, with bombings across the country and ground forces entering its southwest, while calling for Syria to remain decentralised and isolated. And Brazilian airlines are enjoying a boost as fans from all over the country fly to Rio de Janeiro ahead of a free Lady Gaga concert that's expected to draw more than 1 million fans to Copacabana Beach this weekend. The 39-year-old Die With a Smile and Poker Face singer from New York is taking to the stage at the famous beach today as part of Rio's efforts to bring superstars to perform at free events that authorities say lift the local economy. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Welcome to Monocle on Saturday. I'm Georgina Godwin and my guest in the studio with me is Nina dos Santos, who's an international broadcast correspondent. She's also the former CNN Europe editor. Nina, good to see you.
Good to be back. Thanks so much for having me, Georgina, as always.
We were hearing in our headlines all of these elections going on. So there's Australia, there is Singapore, also Britain, local elections. And that's very interesting. I'd like to just start there and have a quick look at what's happening, because it appears that there's a surge for reform.
Yeah, absolutely. This is quite significant in the UK. We had local elections taking place this week across parts of Britain. And normally local elections are quite boring affairs. But this time what they've done is they've crystallised a trend that many people said was coming for some time, and that is potentially the end of the 2 to 3 party state system that we've seen in the UK, where traditionally our politics have been dominated by Labour or the Conservative Party, with a smattering of Liberal Democrats or, say, Scottish National Party MPs in the middle as a third party. That third party trend sort of emerged about 25, 30 years ago. But now it appears as though there's an insurgent party reform led by Nigel Farage that is finally making a huge amount of headway. And if you look at the projections from these local elections, it appears as though reform captured something like nearly 30% of the total popular vote in these local elections. Yes, yes, that's different to a national election, but it's still a terrifying prospect for those two main parties that have had that two-party system over all of my lifetime and generations before.
So tell us, for non-British listeners, exactly what Reform and Nigel Farage mean for this country.
Well, first of all, it's an upending of politics. Perhaps what it might be is Nigel Farage's grand plan could be to enact what we saw happen in Canada in the early 1990s, which was when the Conservative Party's support plummeted so much that it faced a merger with the Reform Party and became the Reform and Conservative Party of Canada. So a reverse takeover because of this sort of populist upswing on the centre and then further to the right side of the electorate. That could well be on the cards, but what is really concerning for those two main parties, as per the electoral map this week, following the upswell in support for reform, is that it's a two-pronged attack. It is not just taking away votes from Conservative councils, mayoral elections, and also, seats that might have voted Tory in the past and in the general election swung to reform, which, by the way, had no MPs previously. It's precursor parties like the UK Independence Party, UKIP, have had a few MPs previously in seats that have switched from Tory to Reform. But this is a party that has come from nowhere. It's Nigel Farage's project that he has leapfrogged from his success with Brexit when he was an MEP in Brussels. He then transformed that message into a national party, and now it is a national party that has to be contended with. One of the other things that happened over the course of this week was not just that Reform took a mayoral seat from the Conservatives up in the north of England by switching a Tory MP who was a former government minister to their cause, Dame Angela Jenkins. They also managed to get a by-election seat in Runcorn, which was a safe Labour seat previously. So, what is concerning here is that the electoral map is being redrawn in the UK without even then needing to be any electoral reform to bring about proportional representation, because what a lot of people had said before from the two traditional parties was that no, reform will be kept in their box unless there is proportional representation, and then all bets are off. But actually Nigel Farage has managed to do this without that big reform.
So it's a swing to the right for this country. And how much of that do you think is driven by Donald Trump?
Well, it's a swing to the right, but it's also a swing to the right on certain in Labour seats as well, largely because what we've seen is, disaffection among voters, feeling that certain issues that, as you said, they're sympathetic with on the right, like immigration and housing and so on and so forth, haven't actually been delivered upon. So it speaks to disaffection in the UK that essentially successive mainstream parties just haven't been able to come up with solutions and enact solutions to the problems that people on all sides of the spectrum feel in this country are being neglected at the moment.
Well, Trump, of course, is looming large, not only here in Britain, but in elections across the world. And one of those places where his re-election is really influencing matters is Australia, as we were hearing in our headlines. So let's go to Canberra, where Latika Bourke, who's the editor-at-large for the Nightly Australia, is on the line. Hi, Latika.
Hi, Georgina.
Good to hear you. So tell us the mood there. What are you feeling?
Look, it could be a strange election. It's an election that is led by two men of the Labor and the Liberal Party. The Liberal in Australia is a centre-right party, and they have really not set the world on fire. They've been very timid, very uninspiring. They put forward no big blockbuster reforms, and that's been a trend in Australian politics for quite some time now. So there's no love for either side. The governing Labor Party has been dealing, just like in the UK, just like in the United States, with this idea of COVID-led inflation that's now abated somewhat. And so they were on the ropes for a long, long time. But surprisingly, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who was not a very good campaigner when he won government very narrowly in 2022, came out of the blocks this year really firing, and he's had a great campaign. I've been on the road with him for 4 of the 5 weeks and the opposition leader for one of those 5 weeks, and he just out-campaigned Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, hands down every single day, barely made a mistake, which is really unusual. So if you're judging by the campaign itself, we think that it looks like a very tight Labor majority. You need 76 seats in Australia to govern. we're thinking, well, I just had a very good Labor source tell me they think they'll get 77. So that's a reduction of 2 seats from where they are currently. And this is a big question, two big questions to be determined by Australia tonight. One, does the governing Labor Party lose its majority for a growth in independent and Green and more far-right parties? That's very possible. Or do we see a suburban-led realignment that we've had in Britain, that we've had in the United States, where working classes flood to the centre-right party and abandon the left-wing party? That was the zeitgeist this time last year. It's less the zeitgeist as we look at the polls closing in Western Australia in a couple of hours' time. That will end this election after a very, very long, exhausting and tiring 5 weeks, Georgina.
How much do you think Trump's re-election has had an impact?
Huge. It's not top of mind. People don't go to the voting box and say, I'm voting for Anthony Albanese because of Donald Trump. But Donald Trump just absolutely railroaded through the first 2 weeks of this campaign. And in Australia, we have a huge culture now of early voting. So by the close of early voting yesterday or this morning, and it's Saturday, we vote on Saturdays in Australia, half the country already voted. So they went to the ballot box with Donald Trump overshadowing the narrative. And that was, of course, the imposition of those tariffs, now wound back, and Australia did not so badly. We only had 10% tariffs. But what it really did was rally the mood around the incumbent Prime Minister. And incumbents, as we know around the world, have had a really bad time last year. Donald Trump, I think what we saw in Canada, and I think what we might see in Australia, could be the start of the end of that anti-incumbency wave. And then you had a duality where the Labor government here ran a very successful campaign, essentially badging the Liberal centre-right leader, Peter Dutton, as a mini-me Trump. And he just never was able to shake that off very well, even though it's not necessarily true. And all these policies that he previously announced, like cutting public servants, like having a government efficiency department of his own, suddenly became absolutely radioactive as the Australian public turned on Donald Trump. So it is very much a latent effect, I think, and it was very much an undercurrent. I don't think you would meet an Australian person saying, I voted against Donald Trump and that's why I voted for Anthony Albanese. But it was really interesting. At Anthony Albanese's final press conference, he was asked, and I was standing right in front of him, he was asked, what's your final message to the people? And he said, in uncertain times, vote for certainty, i.e. me. Now, that's not something he would have said if Kamala Harris was the president of the United States.
Mm-hmm. And just quickly before you go, Latika, you mentioned independence. Are we likely to see a surge for the so-called teal?
Yeah, look, I think this is one of the big questions. The Teals did really well last election, and there is a ongoing trend, just like what happened in local elections with the UK here, where people are turning their backs on the major two parties. Now, Australia has a preferential and a compulsory voting system, which does keep the voting results essentially with the major two by the end. But it was quite a stunning development at the last election in 2022 when all these teal independents took out centre-right seats in progressive heartland. So basically you're looking at what we call in Australia doctors' wives seats. Now we are going to test whether that was a one-off or whether they continue to surge. Interestingly, the Trump effect may also be a knock-on effect for them in a negative, because the Prime Minister has been very clear in asking for a majority. And a lot of people think that they voted in teal independents, but they're actually secret green. So not even Labor. The centre-right Labor Party in Australia is not like a Jeremy Corbyn party at all. It's a very centre, almost, you know, you would almost on some days think it looks like a soft, progressive centre-right party, to be honest. So any sort of extremism on the left and right, Australians don't like, and that's a virtue of our compulsory voting. Some of these teals have been effectively badged as green or quasi-green voters, and so there is a possibility that the public turns against them.
Latika, thank you very much indeed. And it's always great to have you on the show. Back to the studio now, and I'm still with Nina dos Santos. Nina, those are, as Singapore as well as Australia, those are elections that are happening today. Just a slight little look ahead, because on the 18th of May, Portugal has an election. And this is just 14 months after the last poll, right?
Yes, that's right. So Luis Montenegro, who is from the centre-right party, didn't manage to win enough votes for a full majority. His government he cobbled together was, a minority government governing, on an ad hoc basis with certain, trying to push through certain laws, relying upon support from different parties. He was facing an insurgent surge from the far right from a party called Chega, which, as I was just saying before, has upended the political system in Portugal as well, a bit like Nigel Farage's movement here in the UK. But Luis Montenegro also faced then some embarrassing allegations of impropriety, corruption, etc., which politically it's felt he hasn't dealt with very well. He's denied them all. Essentially, I think, if I remember correctly, the allegation was that family members had benefited from his political ties. And as such, Portugal goes back to the polls. Let's remember that the Socialist Party leader Sócrates, back in the days of the bailouts of Portugal and all the other Eurozone, southern Eurozone countries, he also faced similar sort of corruption allegations as well, albeit on a much grander scale. And what this does is this continues to, dismantle support for those mainstream political traditional centre-right and centre-left parties. It torpedoes the centre ground, even in places like Portugal. And then you get these resurgent parties like Chega, as I was saying before. Chega in Portuguese means enough. And that's the whole point here, isn't it? So we're talking about reform in the UK, saying, well, look, the mainstream parties haven't delivered for you on the right, the left, or whatever. And then in Portugal, this insurgent party from the far right saying enough is enough. They're not delivering for you either. And plus ça change. So across the whole of Europe, we're seeing this upending of the centre ground.
What's your Portuguese connection?
My husband is Portuguese, and my in-laws have moved back to Portugal after long and storied careers in the Middle East for about 30 years. But they're, very, very Portuguese family, even though my husband was actually born in the UK, grew up in the Middle East, and was largely educated elsewhere. But, the Portuguese diaspora is a huge cultural phenomenon as well. They make up double-digit percentages of parts of the UK, parts of the Channel Islands like Jersey, a large part of Luxembourg. There's lots of Portuguese who live in Paris and in France, and also heavy components of the Portuguese diaspora lives in Switzerland too. And Australia, by the way, where I'm supposed they're voting.
Yes. Well, Portugal is in fact coming to London next weekend.
So I hear.
Yeah. So it's our spring market, and that's in conjunction with the Portugal, with Visit Portugal, in fact, which is the tourism agency. So what we're going to have is a load of Portuguese food and drink and all sorts of things, lots of Portuguese brands, and of course our own brand, everything from Monocle and from Trunk. It's going to be a lovely day. I'm going to be broadcasting live from outside in the courtyard if the weather's good, and I'm quite sure it will be. So that's going to be a lot of fun.
I looked at the menu, actually. I was pleasantly surprised to see that you had, instead of written Portuguese tarts, it's pastéis de nata, so Portuguese cream tarts. But also what was interesting on this was the promise of port tonics. Now, most people, if they're not familiar with the Douro Valley, which is sort of where my husband's family originally come from, wouldn't know that you get white port, which tastes completely different to what we expect, port to be, which is red and sort of ruby red, very strong wine, fortified wine. White port is completely different. It tastes more like a sort of aperitif, a stronger distilled liqueur, and you have it with tonic and a slice of lemon, and it's really nice. And so this was, the real type of thing that you'd see over there from Porto, not just other parts of Portugal, but specifically from Porto and from the Douro Valley. So I'll definitely look forward to one of those.
Now, you've just been in Portugal. Did your visit coincide with this complete blackout across
Mercifully not, because I wouldn't have been able to get back for the start of the school term or indeed lots of work in London. But I have spent the last week or so talking about it on the airwaves on various shows, because obviously it was such a dramatic meltdown, not just for Portugal, but for Spain, where this power cut originated from, and also for France as well. Parts of southwestern France were knocked out by it. It's a huge embarrassment, largely for Spain rather than Portugal. But my in-laws' telecommunications were knocked out for at least 12 hours. They said they were fine. You know, it was an opportunity to have a nice romantic candlelit supper. But the reality is that lots of people in Portugal and Spain, you know, rely upon increasing amounts of renewable energy. I think on the day when this power cut happened, the two countries were deriving 80% of their electricity needs from renewable power sources. And what this has shown is that we need to update our grids urgently in some of these parts of Europe where they're really investing a lot in renewable energy, because there's big oscillations of current.
But why did it happen?
Well, I was on a show actually with somebody who owns a renewable energy company, who's an electronic engineer sitting next to me, who thankfully took the heavy lifting of explaining the technicalities of what had happened. And we don't actually know. The Spanish grid operator say that they're investigating it. They believe it wasn't a cyber attack. Obviously, when this happened, amid all of the sort of dramatic scenes that we saw of people walking down, you know, crowded, dark tunnels in Barcelona in the metro system and so on, everybody thought, oh, it's hybrid warfare. Well, it appears as though it wasn't a cyber attack. What they think may have happened is some kind of dramatic weather phenomenon, a change in temperature that caused this big oscillation of power. There was a drop of a huge amount of power in a substation in southwestern Spain, and then other failures further along the grid line between Spain, Portugal, and the electricity heading further north towards France. And that took out various substations, and that the grid system isn't prepared for the coincidence of so many substations getting knocked out. But what was also dramatic about this was how long it took Spain to actually reconnect people. And the telecommunication disruptions were felt, I understand, as far as Greenland, because some of their satellites that they use are actually based in Spain. So it just goes to show, as authorities continue to investigate what happens, is that, you know, we obviously, if we're going to be putting more renewables on the system, that the system needs to be able to cope with that. And the reality is in future, all of these countries, Spain's economy is doing quite well, even though Pedro Sanchez, of course, is using this as a political blame game, because he's been in power for quite a long time, since 2018. There's quite a bit of disaffection with the fact that he's governing at the behest, with the Catalan and Basque separatists. And so you can imagine this is going to be a politically charged moment for Spain. But broadly speaking, it's a lesson to all of us that these things can happen, whether nefarious actors are involved or not, I don't know, and that we need to make sure that our systems and infrastructures are able to cope with it.
Absolutely. So definitely our electricity supply companies need to adapt. And that's not the only type of business that's had to adapt. The Folio Society has a reputation for producing high quality, beautifully designed books. Joanna Reynolds, its CEO, joins us now to talk about transforming the company to reach new and younger readers and what's behind the careful curation of their latest summer collection. So Joanna, welcome to Monocle on Saturday. How has the way people engage with Folio Society books changed over the years?
Back in the day, I think people used to get folio books and stick them on their bookshelves and they look lovely, which they do, by the way. But we want people to enjoy them, you know, to read them, to hold them, to love them, to get involved with them. So, yes, they are works of art. And I think increasingly people appreciate the artisticness and the beauty of it. But it's not just a collection thing. It's an emotional thing. People really do care about the books and they really want to have that edition. And I think that's partly driven by the move to ebooks and digital and everything else. You know, people spend so much of their time on computers, online. To get a physical book that you can keep, you can read, you can share, you can pass on generation to generation if you wish to. There's a desire now for that. And there's been a real shift in the people that read our books over the last 10 years.
How so? Explain your demographic.
So when I came in 10 years ago, almost all our books were read by people over 60, very well educated and all of that, but mainly over 60, and more in the UK than anywhere else. Now, our biggest cohort is 25 to 34, and we have as many customers under 25 as we have over 60, which doesn't mean that we've lost the customers that are over 60. During that time, we've grown the customer base significantly, and so reached out to a much wider group of readers and buyers, which is fantastic because our publishing program has also changed, out of all recognition in that time.
Well, tell us about that shift and how are you attracting these younger readers?
I came in and it was still a book club, and that was a model that no longer was working in the marketplace. You could only join in September. And I think because you had to commit to 4 books, it kind of made the business a bit lazy. So when I came in, 90% of the books that we were publishing were out of copyright. And now 95% of the books we publish are in copyright. And the shift that's driven that is sci-fi, fantasy, our non-fiction, which has become more and more successful as well, women's, more children's, and we've also reached out to include a much greater mix of writers, and at the same time have driven into the US. So the US is our biggest market now by revenue and by customers.
And tell me how you've seen the whole sort of publishing business change during your time.
Generally, I think that there's been a shift to local bookshops building their own communities and reaching out. They did a fantastic job during the pandemic. And I think that that's one driver. Certainly hardback books with the whole kind of vinyl, vintage sort of fever that goes on. I think that's become a growth area. With the world as it is, what can take people away perhaps from the world they're living in, and the wellness and the well-being that books can bring to people has become increasingly important to publishers.
And finally, Joanna, can you tell us about your summer collection that debuts on the 6th of May?
Yeah, we're very excited about our summer collection. I'm just going to pick a few books from it, in fact. One is Animal Farm. And obviously, Animal Farm's a sort of pretty key book at any stage in anybody's life and whatever's going on in the world, but perhaps is particularly poignant at the moment. We have published it in the past, but it's the 80th anniversary in the summer. And there are amazing illustrations by Quentin Blake. And we've repackaged it, if you want. So we've got a new slipcase, new frontispiece, looks incredible. And a particularly interesting one is Circe. And, she's the daughter of Helios, who's the god of the sun. He's a mighty titan. She's a kind of outcast. She's not powerful. She's not horrible. She's not beautiful. But she does have witchcraft. So she gets banned and sent off, banished to an island. And she's in that island. She builds her witchcraft. She tames wild animals. And then Odysseus turns up. And so it turns into a love story. And she has to be demolished. And it's brilliant. So that's coming out. And then the last one, which I think is one of the ones also I fought for very hard for us to do, is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. And I've just reread it. And it's just so beautifully written. And, you realise what a storm it caused at the time it was published. And it's being illustrated by Layla Harris, who also did The Colour Purple for us. And that was the first book she ever illustrated. And her illustrations are just out of this world.
Joanna, thank you. That was Joanna Reynolds, the CEO of the Folio Society. We're talking about just out of this world. Some French wine tasters are getting kind of out of it too, not just on the wine, Nina.
Yes, that's right. According to the Times, there's a report that suggests that Bordeaux winemakers are now offering hypnology sessions alongside their tastings to sort of heighten the experience of drinking Bordeaux wine. I've got to confess, part of the old university student in me thought, wasn't Bordeaux the good stuff you drank? And then once you'd had a couple of bottles of that and couldn't tell the difference between the Plonk, you moved on to something a bit cheaper, perhaps towards the Gers in the southwest, further to the southwest. But I suppose this speaks to the growing trend of sort of experience travel and experience food and wine activities. They're offering sessions apparently in Paris at 60 quid a pop, where you put on some headphones, and they're also doing this in the Cité du Vin, which is the Bordeaux famous wine museum. You put on headphones and you have a glass in front of you and you sort of shut your eyes, put your hands out, meditate, and then eventually you have a sniff and a sip of the beautiful wine thereafter, and it tastes 100 times better, supposedly. I got to say, I'm a bit sceptical. This all seems a little bit too much to me. I was out in Bordeaux just 2 weeks ago interviewing owners of big chateaux over there in Pauillac and also in Cadillac, and they were more worried about the Donald Trump tariffs than they were about, whether or not they should be hypnotised into drinking more wine.
Nina, thank you very much indeed. Well, if wine is not to your taste, but white port and port tonic is, then don't forget you can join us next Saturday live here for this very show and for our Portugal-inspired spring market at Midori House. That's all for today's Monocle on Saturday. Many thanks to our producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan, and my guests, Latika Bourke and Nina dos Santos, as well as Joanna Reynolds. And Monocle on Saturday returns the same time next weekend, as I say, live from the market. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.